leading off with a huge thank you to Deltek and Pillsbury for co-hosting this webinar, which we have entitled Getting Ahead of CMMC Compliance. Myself, I'm Neil Began. I'm a partner with Cherry Beckert and joined by some panelists we will hear from in just a second. And we are all very excited to share with you some of the latest insights on CMMC and how to prepare. I mentioned a little bit of housekeeping. We will be monitoring the chat function, but we're asking that all attendees please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen with any questions that you may have throughout the presentation. We will do our best to infuse those, some of which may have already been anticipated, and therefore we will be able to tell you, hey, that's coming up in a little bit, or any that we are not able to get to, we certainly will follow up afterwards. When using the Q&A feature, you can select the everyone if you'd like all attendees and all the panelists to see your question and therefore the responses, or you can make them individualized as well. Contact info will be shared here shortly with the panelists during our intros, but again at the end, and we ask by all means, feel free to reach out to us with any questions, connect on LinkedIn and so forth. So with that said, let's move to intros here. We've got a great panel today, and again, want to thank Deltek and Pillsbury for joining us. And just take a few seconds, if you would, and kind of introduce yourself and your role at your given organization. And certainly, Megan, would love to start with you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Neil. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Doherty. I'm a partner at Pillsbury Winthrop Shop Pittman LLP out of the Northern Virginia office. I focus on government contracts, everything from bid protests, contract negotiations, other types of litigation and M&A work. But a big part of my practice in recent years has been helping companies to comply with cybersecurity requirements and to prepare for CMMC. So I'm delighted to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Megan. Moving around the horn, we've got Michael Greenman from Deltek. Michael?
Hey, thanks, Neil. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Greenman. I'm a senior manager in Deltek's product strategy group. My focus is on cybersecurity and cloud from the product strategy group. And then I also get to dabble a little bit in fun stuff like this in evangelism, education for our customers and prospects and the industry in general to kind of help simplify the very complex nature that government contracting compliance requirements, specifically cybersecurity requirements, tend to be. And Deltek has a wide Rolodex of government contractors, specifically defense contractors. So busy times, and glad for the opportunity to be able to present and have a discussion about CMMC today.
Yep, happy to have you here. And Steve Ursillo.
Thanks, Neil. My name is Steve Ursillo. I'm a partner with Cherry Beckert in the Risk Accounting and Advisory Service Group. I'm a practice lead for information assurance for the firm, and I get involved in an array of different types of assurance services, including CMMC and other cybersecurity initiatives. Been with the firm about 7 years and practicing in the cybersecurity/infosec space for close to 25 years.
Excellent, Steve. And that's how you know you've been around a while, because you still say infosec. Cyber seems to have superseded infosec as a term in the last decade or so, but appreciate all the panelists. Just to round it out, again, my name is Neil Began. I'm a partner with Cherry Beckert, also in the risk advisory space. Have the pleasure of working with much smarter people than myself, like Steve Ursillo, Kurt Mansky, and Brian Kirk, to name a few, who have really been heavily involved in our CMMC efforts. Cherry Beckert as a firm is not only an RPO, but a C3PAO, so we've been through our own certification, so we'll have some insights from Steve as to what that looks like throughout the presentation today, and we're really excited. So we want to jump right in, and maybe, and Steve, I'm going to come right back to you. If it makes sense, let's just level set here. CMMC has been around for a couple of years, but with the vast amount of folks on this webinar, it may make sense just to pause, talk a little bit about what CMMC is, what its intent to protect, certain types of data. And obviously, there's been some changes. So as quickly as you can, kind of talk through that and then where we are with the current state and why this is still such an important initiative for not only the defense industrial base, but quite frankly, a larger population afterwards.
Absolutely. So CMMC is a DoD program built to protect the DIB, defense industrial base, from the increase in the complexities around some of the cyber attacks that are continuing to evolve, kind of keep us on our toes. It builds upon the existing regulations from DFARS 252, 204, 7012 by adding a certification component around the cybersecurity requirements. So all DoD prime and subcontractors planning to bid on future contracts with the CMMC DFARS clause will be required to obtain a certification or meet the CMMC requirements prior to the contract award. Overall, CMMC is designed to provide the DoD with increased assurance that the defense industrial-based companies can adequately protect that sensitive information, whether it's controlled and classified information, CUI, or federal contract information, FCI, and making sure that the information flow down to subcontractors and through the supply chain is adequately protected. The model itself, early indications of the model were 5 levels, but present state 3 levels. So it consists of a foundational, advanced, and expert. And if I unpack those a little bit, you have level 1, which is really foundational. It's 17 practices. And I'll get a little bit more in the weeds here, but 59 objectives over 6 domains. It's really derived from FAR 52, 204, 21, which is really, it's demonstrating basic hygiene practices to protect FCI. So when you think about basic protection around federal contract information, you're really thinking about that level 1. Level 2, which is cumulative. So it does include everything from level 1, but that's advanced, and it's really 110 practice statements, about 320 objectives over 17 domains. That's aligned with NIST 800-171 Rev 2. It's required for contractors that process, store, or transmit CUI information, controlled and classified data. And then there's level 3, which is expert, which is the 110 practices. Again, these are all cumulative. So the 110 practice statements align with NIST 800-171 Rev 2. Plus there's 24 additional practice statements from 800-172 that are required for the highest priority programs as demonstrated by the DoD. And this is really designed to reduce the risk of any type of advanced persistent threat against anybody within that supply chain. So current state, DFARS 252, 204, 7012, which we commonly call 7012, is still being enforced, which requires contractors to implement the technical and procedural safeguards as prescribed by 800-171 Rev 2, and to report security incidents within 72 hours. DFARS 7019 requires contractors to maintain a record of their 171 compliance within SPRS, or the Supplier Performance Risk System. And then you have, DFAR 7020, which requires contractors to provide the government access to its facilities, systems, and personnel anytime that the Department of Defense is renewing or conducting any type of medium or high assessment. So, and then you have obviously DFARS 7021, which is a CMMC rule that is being finalized. And I know we'll talk more to that in the upcoming questions here. Yeah,
lots of numbers, lots of acronyms, hence the world of CMMC. Welcome if you haven't already been inundated with CMMC the last few years. And you mentioned one very common, 7012, and you touched on some of this, but I wanted to go to Megan from a legal standpoint and really from a compliance perspective. Talk a little bit about how CMMC compliance differs from what's currently required of contracts, which, as Steve mentioned, are currently under the DFAR 7012 clause. And then let's also touch on, what would happen if a subcontractor is not to handle this controlled unclassified information, or CUI, as Steve mentioned. Do they still need to worry about CMMC? So kind of a couple things to unpack there, if you could, Megan.
Sure, absolutely, Neil. So as Steve said, and that was a great overview, Steve, of CMMC, so I appreciated it. But as Steve said, the current requirements for protecting CUI, which will put a contractor at CMMC level 2, are the standards that are set forth in NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. Those are the same security standards that are referenced in the 7012 clause that you have probably in virtually all of your DoD contracts or subcontracts. So from a substantive perspective, we're talking about, for most contractors, the same technical requirements that are in your current contracts. The difference from a compliance standpoint is that right now, DoD has basically acknowledged, and I'll spare you the long history here, but DoD has basically acknowledged that most of the DIB has not historically been in full compliance with these requirements. And so as a result, DoD has taken the approach of considering full compliance for the time being with the 7012 clause to mean that a contractor has a system security plan or an SSP that addresses all 110 NIST requirements, And then it also has a POAM, or a plan of actions and milestones, to throw out a few more acronyms here, that addresses any gaps or any risk areas. And so those documents work together to fully respond to the 110 requirements. DoD is taking the position for the time being that as long as you have those documents, you're in full compliance with the data protection portion of the 7012 clause. As Steve also mentioned, we have the 7019 clause that requires contractors to actually score themselves against those requirements and then to report those scores on SPURS. And so that's the current regime that DoD is working with, which is really a practical recognition of where contractors have been up to this point in time. The idea with CMMC is that DoD really does want the entire supply chain to become in full compliance with these requirements. And so rather than living in a world where you can say, okay, we're 50% there and we have half of these controls that we're still working on and they're addressing our POAM, DoD wants everybody who it's sharing CUI with to be at a level 2, just as an example. And so with CMMC, this will be a certification on the front end as opposed to an ongoing certification requirement. There still will be an ongoing certification requirement, but as opposed to simply certifying that you have a complete POAM and a complete SSP. So that's a big difference. And there will be some limited use of POAMs going forward, but it's not going to be the same extensive use that we see now. It's going to be much more limited, and there are going to be certain controls that are not going to be allowed to be addressed through POAMs. In addition, any POAMs are going to have to be closed out really quickly, unlike now where you could have them hanging around for longer. In terms of the question regarding subcontracts, yeah, the CMMC requirements really follow the data. And so if a prime contractor is going to be sharing CUI, for example, with a subcontractor, then the subcontractor is going to need to reach the same CMMC level 2 certification or self-assessment that the prime is required to reach. And that's going to be the case, all the way down the supply chain for anybody that's going to access that kind of data. So I caution anybody who thinks about this as a prime contractor responsibility only, that's really kind of an incomplete view. This is going to trickle down and impact everybody at all levels throughout the DIB.
Yeah, would absolutely agree. And you touched on a couple of things. One, both you and Steve talked about the NIST standard, the 800-171 Rev 2, and that really is the scope for level 2 of CMMC compliance. There is obviously a revision 3 that is out there, but as it stands now, a lot of organizations will reach out to us and say, should we be tracking the Rev 3? And the answer is no. Right now, it is absolutely Rev 2 and intends to be through the final rule. So one of the things that came about in the updates, and Steve touched on this when we moved from really 1.0 to 2.0, is really an increased focus in what are called SPA, security protection assets, certainly a lot more clarity around the use of third parties, be them cloud service providers, managed service providers, and the like. And really that kind of comes back to, Megan, what you were just talking about, the follow the data. That's the easy answer, right? Is where is the data? Where is it coming from? Where does it go? Who has access to it? Where is it being created? How is it being disseminated, and so forth? And for the majority of folks in the DIB, it is not just their organization. They are using some external third-party vendors. And certainly with somebody like Deltek on our panel, we wanted to unpack that a little bit. So Michael, this is giving you enough heads up. I'm coming to you next. One of the things that when you talk about cloud service providers that so many people are using now, and a lot of clarity was given around these third parties, including the CSPs, the cloud service providers for 2.0. What does a CSP need to do to meet the CMMC requirements as it's stated now in this current version of the rule?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And just to kind of follow on what Megan had said about follow the data, I totally subscribe to that. In fact, that's the line that I use, is to understand what the compliance requirement is that you're going to be held accountable for. You've got to know where that data is going to flow, whether that's just prime contractor to their service providers or on down the supply chain to subcontractors. And then you get flow downs and all the legalese with that stuff too. So the thing to remember, that NIST 800-171 standard is just going to apply to the contractor on kind of like, the way I kind of couch it is that's on the ground, right? So then, a lot of these providers, especially smaller businesses that want to do business with, large federal agencies like defense, might be smaller startups, got a great product, great technology, but, they're not They're not a massive company that has resources to build out their own infrastructure. They're going to rely heavily on cloud service providers, SaaS providers. Think of the traditional ones that you would go with. A lot of people use SharePoint, a lot of people use Salesforce, a lot of things like that. So Deltek, with our CostPoint product, has a lot of these defense contractors, and we got into the cloud service provider business relatively near term, about 10 years ago. And so now we're kind of in the thick of it with our customers. And so with the CMMC rule, kind of going back to what you mentioned before with the DFAR 7012 rule, which has been kind of law of the land since 2017, more or less. And then CMMC comes along to actually help enforce that. Cloud service providers are held to a higher standard. NIST 800-171 is a subset of the larger body of controls, NIST 800-53. And so as a result, cloud service providers are held to that higher standard, about the same standard that the agencies are held to for their cloud services, and that is using the FedRAMP program to assess. And for those not familiar, FedRAMP is or was specifically came about through FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act. And what this program is a very, very robust program for making sure that securing data, especially amongst federal agencies that use cloud service providers, is held to a higher standard. So what DFAR 7012 originally did, and now CMMC with this proposed 32 CFR rule that's coming out very, very soon, has held cloud service providers to that higher standard that just serve defense contractors. And so what that means is, cloud service providers like Deltek with our CostPoint product, we need to demonstrate FedRAMP moderate or higher authorization or equivalence. And those kind of go down two different paths. So I can kind of pause it there for a moment or dig into what those particular paths would mean. But just kind of summarize, cloud service providers are held to that higher standard, which is that FedRAMP moderate or higher security standard.
Yeah, I know we're going to touch on FedRAMP here in a little bit. But one of the things you talked about was kind of this, two things. One, the idea of establishing what's called a system boundary, and Megan touched on this as well, I think is one of the most important things for folks, getting involved with CMMC is really figuring out where that data resides, be it the FCI, the Federal Contract Information, or the CUI information in that data set, because as mentioned, it could be sitting on, a cloud provider's, system. It could be with third parties. It could be with your MSP, and certainly it could be within your organization, and may need to be protected even within your organization. So a lot of work is typically spent upfront determining if the system boundary is complete and accurate, and being able to defend why certain things are in scope, and as equally as you can defend why certain things are not in scope for CMMC. So that very point, very well taken. The other thing that you mentioned, Michael, was kind of this idea of the rule coming out soon, and CMMC has been evolving for the last few years. Certainly there's been some pauses and pushbacks due to everything from a global pandemic to change in administration, which certainly we have a large election looming over us in the next 12 months. So in terms of the rules coming out soon, I wanted to kind of come back to Steve from a timeline perspective. In terms of what we know, where we are now, what is the expected timeline for CMMC being required in terms of companies needing to achieve certification, and how should contractors at this point, based on that anticipated timeline, plan their compliance journey?
The Code of Federal Regulations, which is commonly referred to as the CFR, so CFR 32 Part 170, which is relevant to national defense, that was really used to stand up the CMMC program itself, right? So when you think about the cyber AB and the C3PAOs, the folks that can actually do the certification, so on and so forth, that's currently being reviewed by ORA right now. So the release of the final rule is anticipated by the end of Q3. So a lot of this stuff is already in motion. It's just a matter of when those final rules get approved and then released. So that one for CFR 32 is going to be targeted for sometime this fall. The CFR 48, which is really relevant to, obviously applying the contractual provisions, so the Federal Acquisition Regulation Systems relevancy there, that revises the DFAR's 7021 contract clause and points back to the details of CFR 32, which is really, once again, around implementing CMMC into the contracts and how to follow through with that. That's anticipated to be out for Q1 of 2025 at the earliest. So the interesting thing is you have these two rules, where one, obviously, for the program, CFR 32, is going to be targeted for late fall. And then you have CFR 48, that's going to be early spring or whatnot, sometime in Q1. You're going to have a gap. And the anticipation and the hope is that, the organizations that are seeking the compliance are going to obviously start those initiatives once CFR 32 is in play, obviously with the prioritization of the relevancy within the supply chain. And then ultimately, when 48 hits and it starts to go into, when CFR 48 hits and it starts to go into the contracts themselves, then folks will obviously have to be mandated by that timeline. So the implementation of those requirements is really going to get rolled out in 4 phases. And again, this is referring back to DFAR 7021, which is the actual implementation of CMMC. Phase 1 is going to begin on the effective date of the revision to DFAR 7021, or the finalization, I would say, of CFR 48. That's going to include CMMC Level 1, CMMC Level 2 self-assessments. So either at that date of release or prescribed within that rule, it's going to tell you, okay, as of that time, you'll need Level 1 or Level 2 self-assessments. Phase 2 is going to really begin around 6 months following the start date of Phase 1. And that's going to include the CMMC Level 2 certification assessments that requires a C3PAO, where applicable. Because there are certain cases where for organizations that are handling CUI, depending on the type and the risk level, where they may be able to do a self-assessment. Then what's going to happen is you'll have Phase 3, which begins a calendar year following the start of Phase 2. That's going to include CMMC Level 2 certification assessment, which again requires a C3PAO, and a CMMC Level 3 certification assessment where applicable there, and those higher elements of risk that are prescribed in the contractual process to have that coverage for Level 3. And then you're going to have Phase 4, which is 1 calendar year following the start date of Phase 3. That's full implementation. So the DoD will include CMMC program requirements and all applicable DoD solicitations and contracts. So, we get the question quite often, when should I start? We had talked earlier about the fact that the requirements for NIST 800-171 have been around for a while, and self-assessments have been around for quite some time. So it's really polishing up and making sure that folks are getting a handle on the scope, the boundaries, the type of data, the classification of data, and making sure that they're starting their program journey sooner than later. And obviously, when these rules go into effect, depending on the prioritization of the organization and the type of information they handle, they'll be put on a prioritized list. But that kind of gives you kind of an outline of what that timeline is going to look like.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that. And there is no easy answer. There are such varying degrees of maturity with even the organizations we speak with on a daily basis. Sure, Megan, the same thing with you and Michael. We have folks that they've never had to comply really with any standard, let alone a federal standard. And then we have others that, they have gone through, they're publicly traded, so they've gone through Sarbanes-Oxley for years. They're heavily documented. They get SOC audits. They get PCI if they're handling credit card data. They do ISO international standards for their IT systems and so forth. So it really depends on where you are. There's certainly an easier lift for some than others. It also depends obviously on the complexity of your environment, the use of third parties, some of the things we've been talking about. But the other common term that keeps coming up over and over again in each of your answers is, this idea of the supply chain and for subcontractors. And we touched on it earlier, Megan, and I want to come back to you really from a legal standpoint for, maybe any of the primes that are listening in today and or subcontractors, if they have kind of the same curiosities. From a legal standpoint, responsibility wise, do prime contractors, will they bear any risk for their subcontractors or their suppliers as it relates to non-compliance with CMMC?
Sure, absolutely, Neil. And a lot of the legal risk is really business risk here too. With CMMC, as we talked about, this is really going to be a gating requirement as opposed to just an ongoing certification requirement. And so for prime contractors who currently rely on subcontractors for key portions of performance of their contracts, there's going to be a bar on using those subcontractors on a going forward basis once CMMC is rolled out, if they're not certified at the correct level of CMMC compliance. And so as a business matter, a lot of prime contractors that we work with now are starting to diligence their supply chains at this point in time. And that's for compliance with the 7012 clause, but really it's just as important for CMMC being on the horizon, because there is this concern that you're going to have a supplier who is a part of your team, or who you really need to rely on to complete important requirements, and you're not going to be able to go forward with them if they haven't not only started to undergo the process of implementing the NIST controls, but actually gone through the certification process by the award date for the prime contract. And so from that side of things, it's certainly a big business risk to prime contractors and to subcontractors alike. In terms of legal compliance, I'll get back to that saying that Michael and I like of following the data. Prime contractors are certainly going to be responsible from a legal perspective to not share certain types of data with subcontractors, suppliers, really any third parties that aren't at the appropriate CMMC level. And so a prime contractor is going to need to be, very vigilant about that. They're going to need to flow down the appropriate CMMC clauses as part of their subcontracts. So that takes some administrative effort that, would be better, better spent in advance before the requirements are on your doorstep. And then also it takes a level of getting your arms around what kind of data you have and who you need to share it with that also pays off if you do some of that legwork in advance. And you touched on, Neil, earlier, this idea of the boundaries being very important, figuring out which systems are within your CMMC boundaries. And I absolutely agree with that. I would even take it one step further back, is contractors need to figure out what data they have that might constitute CUI or FCI. And it sounds like, you would think that would be a straightforward question. We have these definitions. There are certainly instances where agencies stamp documents as CUI, but the agencies do that pretty incompletely, I would say. The definition of CUI it's so broad. You can get online on the NARA e-libraries, the CUI libraries, and you can look up different definitions. But really, any information that's subject to any type of dissemination control or has any type of restriction in terms of who you can share it with or who can access it, that constitutes CUI. And so I think a lot of organizations think about their ITAR information, they think about PII and HIPAA information, they think about kind of discrete categories. But when you're performing a contract for DoD or for any federal agency, there is a high likelihood that the definition of CUI is a lot broader than just these discrete categories. And so thinking about that in advance and being realistic about, not only the data you need to protect, but the data that you're sharing with others and what they need to protect is a really important first step. And unfortunately, it's almost never as straightforward as just looking at what data you get that's marked or identified affirmatively by the government.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple of things, which I think is going to answer my tack-on question here, because I think it's probably the same answer in terms of what prime contractors should be doing now from a legal and contract perspective to ensure that their own subcontractors and their other supply chain is ready for CMMC. I'm sure it's making sure, reaching out, asking them, what have they done to date, asking whether or not they've established a system boundary, done the data classification and identification work that you touched on. Anything else that you are, advising your clients that are prime contractors to be doing at this stage? We're sitting here in the middle of July 2024 with the rules looming, as Michael and Steve have mentioned, to in terms of communicating up and down their supply chain to their subcontractors and so forth. What are you advising now for folks?
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely the things you touched on, Neil. We're also seeing a lot of prime contractors that are actually requesting copies of subcontractor basic assessments, at least the score that they've uploaded, so that they can get a sense of how far along their important suppliers really are in their cybersecurity maturity and how far they have to go. Some primes are sharing resources and are assisting in that way, or at least providing information regarding resources that can help subs to come into compliance more quickly. We're seeing really aggressive subcontract terms. Sometimes, just in the body of the subcontract itself, you're trying to shift a lot of the risk to the subcontractor in the event that they're not in full compliance. But we're also seeing a lot of surveys and a lot of more in-depth questionnaires at the front end of the process, maybe during the teaming negotiations, even before you've signed a formal subcontract, really trying to diligence, which of these controls have you rolled out and which haven't you? And, it's not going to be, we're not generally seeing prime contractors that are like coming out and auditing their supply chain or anything like that. But we are seeing a heightened level of diligence that's being performed on the front end, even in some instances before subcontracts are formalized.
Gotcha. Very good. And I kind of want to shift a little bit back to the technology side of the house to Michael. Similar question, but maybe what are some of the tips and best practices when evaluating cloud services when it comes to not only cyber compliance, but eventually the CMMC final rule?
Yeah, there's a lot. And again, it just depends on where you're at in the whole scheme of things. It was mentioned a little bit, but there are all sorts of different types of external service providers when it comes to CMMC, when it comes to DFAR 7012. So I can speak to the cloud service provider aspect of it. And you're right, there is lots of confusion out there, lots of acronyms, lots of numbers, lots of confusing things. So the way that Deltek looks at the world, the way that I communicate it is that we know, our cloud product, our cost point product serves a lot of the largest defense contractors as well as subcontractors that they utilize. And so we know it was important to make sure that we were going to achieve the highest standard that we could. So we made the very conscious effort to migrate into a commercial platform that was a Gov Cloud that had the authorization, but that's not where it stops. You don't inherit authorization. You don't inherit all of that things. That's considered more infrastructure or platform. You, as a SaaS provider or software provider, you've got to go the step further, which is to add additional controls, to add additional layers of security, encryption, network security, all sorts of things, user validation, and that's where our product kind of differentiates. So I would say, to somebody looking around the market, like, how can you tell, right? There's all sorts of marketing fluff out there, and we run into that constantly too. So again, another thing that Deltek did was take the step further in anticipation of the great need that our customers and potential prospects would need someday, is that we put it all out there. We did what we could do at this phase and went and got an external assessment through FedRAMP. And so our cost point GCCM product is now on the FedRAMP marketplace. We're listed as FedRAMP moderate ready. Would we love to be authorized? Absolutely. The one that'll hitch with FedRAMP is that to be authorized, you have to have an agency sponsor. And right now, our cost point product is just not sold to federal agencies. We focus on contractors. So due to the nature of the bureaucratic beast, we're at this ready status. But there's a lot of providers that are not. There's only 100 and change cloud providers that are on the FedRAMP marketplace. So maybe a little bit biased, but I would strongly advise looking at the FedRAMP marketplace first, see who's on there, see who's not, for the companies that have actually gone through the gauntlet, right, to get that check, especially cloud providers, because that standard's so much higher. And it's difficult. It's a huge investment, and it really kind of thins the herd when you look at it that way. So we've done that. Next steps there, because ready status doesn't get you there. We have to prove equivalence. That's the next step, as I was alluding to before. Authorization would be great. All the big infrastructure cloud providers have that. The Amazons, Oracles, Googles, and Microsofts of the world. Our product resides on top of that type of infrastructure, as do many of the other SaaS solutions. So like I said, we've gone the step further and gotten our own FedRAMP ready status. And so to prove equivalence, we have to put together what's called a body of evidence. And that gets into a whole other line of stuff, but that's just to say it's a whole lot of additional proof and evidence that is going to be required as a part of CMMC audits, level 2 and level 3. So I think a lot of contractors might get caught off guard by this, because I'm sure their vendor's been telling them forever, yeah, you're good. But now push is going to come to shove, and Deltek, again, for one, has made the investment and made the stated purpose and intention to make sure we're prepared, so that when our customers come to us and say, hey, where's this FedRAMP authorization, body of evidence stuff? And our intention, our timing aligns very well with when the CMMC rule and these assessments are going to start. And we anticipate there will be a large volume of demand for this necessity for proving FedRAMP equivalence.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one thing I'll tell you, Michael, is when you co-host a webinar or sit on a panel, you're absolutely allowed to be biased. So take advantage.
Taking liberties.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's stick with you. You talked about body of evidence. Certainly there is a large demand when it comes to documentation of everything from data classification to system boundaries, some of the things we talked about. But for achieving certification, there are specific documentation requirements. I mentioned at the top that Cherry Beckert, here's a little bias, Michael, for you, so you don't feel alone. We are a C3PO, so we are certified to conduct assessments. As a result of being certified, we actually had to go through the program ourselves and be audited by the DCMA's audit arm, which is DIBCAC, to achieve our own CMMC Level 2 certification. And Steve, which is great to have on this panel, was heavily involved in that process. And so I wanted to kind of stay with documentation here for a second, Steve, and maybe talk about as a C3PO, what are the specific documentation requirements for achieving CMMC certification, and how can contractors ensure that they're adequately prepared for that lift of documentation and being, auditable, to use that term?
That's great. That's a great question, Neil. So, we're typically an organization is going to start with their system security plan. That's going to help the organization achieve, maintain, improve their organizational security structure related to the compliance assessment and the certification. So having a pretty verbose system security plan that meets all the requirements as specified within the CMMC requirements is going to be something you'll have to have well ahead of time. That's part of assessing and planning in the phases of the assessment. So along with that, you're going to also want to have a shared responsibility matrix. So and we've been talking a lot about working with cloud providers here on this call. And if you're working with external parties and cloud providers, you need to be able to identify, which elements of the controls that are applicable to the assets that are in the networks and everything else that are in your environment are relevant to your team's responsibilities versus what's responsible by the cloud service provider or an MSP or anything like that. So that shared responsibility matrix is going to become very important in prescribing really what your team's organizationally responsible for, in addition to how you're actually achieving the proof of compliance initiatives for the third parties that you're using, whether they're going through the CMMC assessment themselves, whether they have to have a system security plan related to how they're helping you, or whether or not, as Michael was talking to, they have FedRAMP equivalent or moderate or FedRAMP themselves, right? So there's going to be different things that you'll lean on there through that process. Network diagrams are really important to understand the inflows and the outflows and the boundaries of the systems. And in many cases, we talked about it here, but having that asset inventory, identifying all the different types of assets. And what I mean by that is you have, CUI assets that store, process, and transmit controlled and classified information. You have security protection assets that are really around managing and protecting those CUI assets. You have contract risk management assets, you have specialized assets, and then you may have assets that are out of scope. The reason why I get granular with that is it's really important to understand the assets that you have and how they interact with that data and how they reside within the network diagram to properly scope the engagement. The last thing you want to do is misclassify an asset or misclassify a network and get into the real depth of doing your assessment and find out that your scoping's off, or you have a problem, or it's not meeting your overall business objectives. So that's really important to analyze and get a good grip on up front. Making sure you have a good incident response program that meets all the requirements and obviously allows you to report back within 72 hours. If you have a breach, that's obviously going to be something that you'll want to adhere to. And then, of course, all the supporting policies and procedures that are applicable based on the objectives are going to be relevant and needed to be accessible when it comes time to actually do your assessment. All the evidence that supports The 800-171A assessment objectives is going to need to be accessible. And then, of course, you have your plan of action and milestones if required. And obviously, knowing how to navigate any of the requirements or limitations on those POAMs, which ones are acceptable and which ones are not. Those are all things that we would consider relevant and important to get a handle on as you step into your endeavors.
One of the things that you mentioned was this concept of a responsibility matrix. And again, not to hammer home, but oftentimes this will be, or it could be the responsibility of somebody that's not in your organization. It could be somebody at Deltek, it could be somebody from your managed service provider, it could be any other third party. And if the controls for protecting this information is under their purview, they in turn, as mentioned earlier, could be part of your system boundary and therefore would be subject to this certification process. So making sure and aligning with your third parties, ensuring who has responsibility, documenting it as such, and making sure that they are clear that they may get pulled in to your certification effort is very important. And it's something that is not always as common in some of the other kind of adjacent IT compliance areas where the answer is, well, we don't do that. We pay somebody to do that. It's been outsourced. We're just going to stay with what's under our purview. CMMC has made it so that that boundary can stretch well beyond either the physical or virtual walls of your organization. I know we've got a question in the chat coming back to FedRAMP. Michael, I know you touched on FedRAMP, and we were gonna pick it up here towards the end. So let's just jump to that, and then I'm going to come back to Steve and talk a little bit more about the assessment and some of the pitfalls that maybe folks can look to avoid. But as it relates to FedRAMP, one of the questions in there was there's so many that are backlogged in this FedRAMP ready state, right, versus FedRAMP authorized, and what will be the path to use those folks before they meet full compliance. And certainly you can talk a little bit about any of Deltek's plans for achieving moderate authorization or equivalence for your cost point product that so many folks are using. Maybe touch on that if you could.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? It's definitely kind of a legal discussion meets a technology discussion. It's this kind of convergence of a lot of different things. Plus, there's two competing versions out there right now of what equivalence is. There's this DoD memo that was put out in January this year, and then the CMMC version of equivalence for FedRAMP is a tiny bit different. So hopefully that'll get all ironed out, that aside for a moment. But when it comes to the FedRAMP program itself, caveat, don't work for FedRAMP, not on the inside. This is purely just a perspective from what I understand, what I know. But the FedRAMP program itself has limited ways of getting an authorization. The easiest is, do business with an agency, and that agency, whether it's defense or whatever, can get you through the process. They sponsor you, and then you've got that, ability to go in and prove it, and then you're authorized and, go on your merry way. In fact, Deltek has a product, a fairly new acquisition called Replicon that is FedRAMP authorized, working with one of the agencies. But as you point out, CostPoint is not, because CostPoint's not sold to those agencies. So what do you do without an authorization? And what about all these companies in ready status? Just full disclosure, ready status doesn't get you there. If an assessor is asking you for FedRAMP moderate or higher authorization or equivalence, the ready status is not going to mean much. It's a great indicator that you're most of the way there. You're ready for the full assessment. But that's where this equivalence label, if you will, or a process with the body of evidence comes in. And that body of evidence, depending on which document you're looking at, will consist of a couple of items, including what's called a security assessment report, the system security plan, as was mentioned before, the POAM, and then there's a few other items in there too, but lots and lots of proof, evidence. Most importantly, just like with CMMC for defense contractors, you need that independent, certified third-party auditor. FedRAMP has got their own group. Sometimes, there's companies that do both. But for all intents and purposes, it's a separate thing. And so these recognized third-party assessors, once they're, contracted by cloud service providers, they get to look under the hood, they kick the tires, they go through everything. And that's done for, again, on behalf of this program, whether it's DFAR 7012 or the CMMC program, to ensure that the cloud service provider meets the FedRAMP standard, right? Authorization is ideal, but if you can't get it, equivalence is determined by the production of these items, which in totality are called body of evidence. So can't speak to FedRAMP's backlog. There are plans that I've heard of that they're going to expand the ability to get authorizations for companies like Deltek and others that don't do business directly with agencies. That's a bit of speculation, kind of reading tea leaves. But right now, as it stands, the only method you can get an authorization from FedRAMP with is through the agency sponsor, because they took away the JAB, the Joint Advisory Board program earlier this year. So can't speak much beyond FedRAMP with that, but definitely there is this proof, this body of evidence. And if we're advising, or if somebody were to ask me, how can I tell, right? How can you tell if a cloud service provider is even going to be able to do it? I go back to the FedRAMP marketplace is a great place to start, but that CRM, the customer responsibility matrix, also called a shared responsibility matrix, is a great place to start too, because then you see all the controls, that they claim to be delivering and providing, and then how those controls would map to your NIST 800-171 controls that you are essentially kind of outsourcing to the cloud service provider. So those are the important things to ask for, to verify. And then the next question is, how do you know what you're looking at? And then that's when you need a trusted, partner to be able to help you with that part too.
Agreed. And Megan, I want to come back to you here. So, we are all, and you just heard from Michael in terms of some of the plans from Deltek in terms of achieving compliance and some of the steps they've already taken. You've heard from Steve and myself about, us becoming a C3PO so that we can certify folks. And there's an assumption that everybody's just going to do this, right? Everybody has to do it or needs to do it, and everybody's going to fall in line. Certainly, we found that not to be the case. So wanted to come back to you and just talk about maybe what are some of the consequences for not complying with CMMC at this point?
Sure. So, some of the biggest risks that every company will face are the risks I talked a little bit about earlier, which is, the business risk of your federal pipeline of work being interrupted as a result of not meeting the CMMC requirements. DoD, as much as they've compromised on certain parts of the program in CMMC 2.0 from the initial iteration of the program, one thing that has not changed is that this is going to be a gating item. So that's certainly, from a business perspective, one of the biggest risks. From a legal perspective, the government is extremely focused right now on cybersecurity, for obvious reasons. There have been so many high-profile breaches, go back to SolarWinds and before, that this is an area of focus both within DoD and within the government at large. We've seen the Department of Justice set up a cyber fraud task force, which basically has been tasked with going out and identifying contractors who have knowingly misrepresented the level of cybersecurity compliance that their companies have reached. And we've seen, as a result, some high dollar value settlements come out of that task force. There's some ongoing litigation. In addition to that, we've seen litigation that has come about from other federal agencies kind of separate and apart from this task force. So DoD in particular has brought False Claims Act cases against contractors. And this isn't always a situation where a contractor is fully out of compliance with their obligations, or where there's some major breach or major incident that leads to this type of lawsuit. A lot of times these are whistleblower cases where somebody says, hey, company X has been certifying that it's in full compliance with CMMC and that it has a perfect score for all 110 of these requirements, of the NIST requirements. And in reality, we know there are gaps and that there are miscertifications here. And we saw in a case that was brought a couple of years ago, the Aerojet Rocketdyne case, that courts have said, you can move forward with those cases. That meets the materiality threshold that courts are looking at to determine whether the government can bring an FCA case in this context. So we anticipate that this is going to continue as CMMC is rolled out, that the government's going to continue to be interested in this area. And I think, that there is, however, I think some good news coming for contractors with CMMC. And that is that right now, when you're making these certifications, you're kind of on your own maintenance, right? I think most contractors are working with a third party, like a Cherry Beckert or a firm like that is coming in and is performing the audits, at least for internal purposes for the companies. But you're alone making that certification. Once you're within CMMC, if you are being certified at CMMC level 2 or level 3, and you require an assessment by a C3 PAO, then you're going to have that cover of having an outside entity that has assessed you at a certain level. Of course, there could still be issues that come up, but I think just as a practical implication, as a mitigation factor, that's going to be something that's going to give contractors a little bit more cover. However, on the other side of things, we're still going to have a lot of contractors that are self-assessing. So there are going to be contractors at level 2 that are allowed to self-assess, and then there are going to be contractors, everybody at level 1 is going to be performing a self-assessment. So when you're in the self-assessment realm, all of the same considerations that exist now under 7012, all those risks are going to be just as heightened as they are right now. And I tell my clients when they come and they're trying to figure out what to do, that it's just absolutely so important that you're working with an organization that can come in and can perform an audit for your internal planning purposes before you go ahead and make the self-assessment, so that along the way you're measuring the level of compliance that you're reaching, as you go. Because we are seeing agencies ask a lot of questions. We're seeing agencies come in and ask for copies of SSPs and POAMs. The 7012 clause right now allows for pretty broad investigative rights for agencies in the event that there is some type of a breach or an incident that's reported. And we're seeing agencies act on those rights, or DoD agencies act on those rights and come in and really want to perform their own investigation in the event that there is some type of incident. So I would just, my advice to contractors is that, this risk is going to be there going forward, and that it's really important to make sure that you're confident that the service providers you're working with, your internal team is keeping, is making sure that any certifications you make are 100% accurate.
Yeah, Megan, and I'm going to come right back to you, but just really quick, we had a question posed in the chat about a specific Deltek product, and we're going to have contact information here shared at the end, or Michael, you can go ahead and respond in with your email. We're going to run out of time to address that. I know you can put them in touch with the Vision product team over at Deltek. So I'll just ask that you put your email as a response to that question, so that person can ping you on the side, and we can make sure we get that answer, since we're going to run out of time here. Megan, certainly we talked about CMMC, the past 50 so minutes. It's the largest kind of cyber initiative in the DoD, but it's not the first, right? So historically, have we seen the DoD take any action to date against contractors in connection with any of the prior existing cybersecurity requirements?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, we've seen action in connection with the 7012 clause, and with similar clauses coming out of other agencies. The Aerojet Rocketdyne case that I mentioned, that was sort of the pinnacle case that got everybody's attention, because everybody wondered, what is the standard that you have to demonstrate to move forward. And there the government took the position that basically, every invoice that was sent during the period that the company was over-representing the level of cybersecurity maturity that it had reached was a false claim against the government. Now that case ended up settling, as many of these cases do, but that's a lot of pressure on a contractor. So I think that was a case that DoD views as a victory in terms of its legal position, in terms of using the FCA as a tool against contractors. We've also seen a lot of high-profile settlements. And another one that was very high-profile in the government contract space was a settlement that came through at the beginning of 2023, and then ended up settling in September, and that was the Verizon case. So we've certainly seen DoD pursue False Claims Act litigation, and then we've seen DoD just pursue a lot of investigative work. So even for cases that have not actually ultimately made it to court, cases that aren't associated with whistleblowers or anything like that, we have just seen DoD be really aggressive whenever it identifies a potential issue that could be related to an over certification, I'll say. So these aren't always fraud cases in the way that we think about them, as if there's some master plan to defraud the government, but more instances where a contractor is aware that it is certifying that its cyber maturity is beyond that which it can actually demonstrate.
Yeah, and we talked a couple of times about just the movement that has occurred in the CMMC program in its lifetime, which is fairly short in the grand scheme of things, but a lot of different changes, and that has changed the scope for a number of folks. We talked about the addition of SPAs, security protection assets, and some of the ESPs, the external service providers. Certainly, Michael's talked about cloud service providers. We mentioned MSPs and so forth. So we found in dealing with clients that may have been really out in the forefront, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and really got out there and maybe even had their own DIBCAC assessment themselves as an organization. There's still a gap analysis that needs to be done to the CMMC 2.0 with the advent of, as Steve mentioned, 800-171 revision 2. So it's not a set it and forget it exercise. It's still, honestly, we don't think it's going to change a lot, but still has the ability to with this final rule still being set. So Steve, I wanted to kind of wrap up with you just in terms of, a lot of the folks on the call, I'm sure, are at different stages here, but having gone through an assessment as an organization, and being an integral part of that, what would you say are some of the common challenges or pitfalls for contractors to look out for and steps they can take to mitigate some of those?
Yeah, so not only going through our own assessment, but helping organizations through the readiness process. We've identified a few different areas that I think are sticking points, some of which we've already kind of talked to here, but just kind of re-emphasizing that. But the requirements are pretty prescriptive, and there's obviously certain interpretations based on the subject matter that you have to adhere to. So having the right folks that understand the requirements and know how it's applied within the organizations become really paramount, right? So that you're not either unintentionally misrepresenting or missing any key components. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it too is, if you do receive any POAMs and they're not I'll say a POAMable item where it's not accepted, being able to mitigate and or respond to that so that you can, get that in a position of achieving compliance at a certain point is certainly something that we've seen some challenges with. We talked about it earlier, but I can't stress it enough that understanding what constitutes FCI and CUI is really key, and having that prescribed in the contracts, making sure you have a clear identifier. And if you're in a process where you're obviously creating information, and some of that information is really, I'll say, everyday commercial information that gets then incorporated with something that becomes CUI, becomes a challenge for some organizations. At what point in that process is that CUI, and how do you identify that and protect that if you're setting up specific enclaves or systems or boundaries, right? How does that affect the manufacturing plan? How does that affect the cloud provider, so on and so forth? So making sure that you're clear on that process becomes really important. The asset identification process, I have seen present, believe it or not, some challenges just as far as whether or not something is, for example, a CUI asset or a security protection asset, what that's going to mean, what providers you can use, and how they're going to be orchestrated, what subscription you need to get in order to protect that data based on that classification. Those are other elements. I mean, that falls typically even greater when you start thinking about, export controls, no foreign and ITAR data, things along those lines. And really just making sure that, you're looking at it from the standpoint of your entire security stack and how it's relevant to CMMC is just another area where, you have certain things that are maybe handling your commercial environment, and then you have to think about how it's handling your CUI or your certain types of environments related to the level of certification that you're looking to adhere to. Some of the more non-technical challenges really come around the prioritization. So we've seen MSPs and other organizations that really want to get prioritized because they have a lot of customers and things like that. So making sure that you're on a list and you're prioritized and you're trying to deal with that. Right now, a lot of the focused assessments that are joint surveillance are done primarily at the prime level. there's inherently a lack of resources as it pertains to people who are certified and qualified to provide these services. So that is also something that we see organizations struggling with. And that could be on, people in their own staffing, in their own, employee regiments in order to execute on the jobs they just don't have the experience in doing these types of assessments or what's required. In addition, I think when you look at the overall process, a lot of your decisions are going to be predicated on risk assessments. So organizations have been told forever in different compliance requirements to get risk assessments. Now you're taking it down to a level where you're bringing in all of the CMMC implications into your risk assessment to make sure that the decisions you make are justified in the positioning that you do within your system security plan, your scope, your architecture, and your boundaries. So those are some of the common pitfalls that I would say definitely have surfaced up, and obviously we've navigated those challenges.
I appreciate it. We're going to nail it right on the money here as Maddie brings up our contact information. I talked about at the top of the call. Certainly, we wanted to provide this. The other thing that we'll offer up, there's been a lot of information from, I know, the timelines and the year to date and this rule and that rule. We've summarized everything, and we'll send it out on a placemat. Certainly, feel free to use as needed. We wanted you to have contact information. We welcome any conversations outside of this hour. I really want to thank you, Steve, Megan, and Michael. Certainly was insightful, which was really the intent of where we are with CMMC. We thank everyone that joined today. Thank you for not only all the panelists, but all of the work that went into putting this together. And by all means, we wish everyone luck on their CMMC journey. And if you need anything, you have all of our contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.